The evening had been planned for months. The Hargrove family estate sat at the edge of a quiet Connecticut town, surrounded by oak trees that had stood longer than anyone could remember. Margaret Hargrove, the family matriarch, had organized the annual winter gathering with her usual precision, sending out embossed invitations to every person of importance she knew. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, and socialites had all confirmed their attendance. The centerpiece of the evening was meant to be her daughter, Celeste, a classically trained pianist who had studied at a conservatory in Vienna and returned home with a reputation that her mother had carefully curated and proudly displayed at every opportunity. Celeste was 26, polished, and aware of exactly how she was perceived in their social circle. She wore her talent like jewelry, always present, always visible, always catching the light when others were watching. Her mother had arranged for her to perform 3 pieces that evening, including a Chopin nocturne that Celeste had been perfecting for 2 years. The grand piano in the East drawing room had been tuned twice that week. Fresh flowers surrounded it. Extra chairs had been brought in and arranged in careful rows. Everything had been designed to make Celeste the undeniable heart of the evening. No one thought about the maid. Her name was Adise, and she had worked for the Hargrove household for almost 3 years. She was quiet, dependable, and invisible in the way that people in service are often made to feel invisible. She arrived early and left late. She remembered how Margaret liked her tea, which always needed extra attention before guests arrived, and which family members required more careful handling than others. She did her work without complaint and without noise, and the family had grown so accustomed to her presence that they rarely acknowledged her beyond a nod or a brief instruction. What no one in the Hargrove household knew, because no one had ever thought to ask, was that Adise had grown up playing the piano. She had started at the age of 5 in Lagos, taught by a church organist who recognized something in the way she listened to music before she ever touched a key. By the time she was 12, she was playing for the Sunday congregation. By 16, she had studied theory, composition, and performance under a teacher who told her that her hands carried something rare. Life had taken her in a different direction, as it does for many people, and the opportunities she had once imagined for herself had been replaced by responsibilities that came with immigration, survival, and supporting her younger siblings back home. But the music had never left her. It lived in her fingers even when her fingers were busy with other things. On the night of the gathering, Celeste fell ill. It was sudden and humiliating in the way that only body failures can be, arriving without warning and without sympathy for timing or occasion. She had felt a headache building through the afternoon but had dismissed it. By 6 in the evening, she was pale and shaking, and by 7, when guests had already begun arriving downstairs, she was lying in her room completely unable to perform. Margaret was mortified. She moved through the early part of the evening with a practiced smile that her guests recognized as tension, explaining that Celeste was unwell and that the musical portion of the evening would need to be adjusted. The guests responded with the particular kind of polite disappointment that wealthy people perform when something fails to meet their expectations. Some of them had come specifically to hear Celeste. One woman, a close friend of Margaret's named Patricia, said loudly enough for several people to hear that it was such a shame, that she had been looking forward to the performance all month, and that she hoped the evening would not feel too incomplete without it. Another guest laughed quietly at something whispered in his ear, and the laughter had a texture to it that felt unkind. Adise was moving through the room at that moment, collecting empty glasses from the side tables near the fireplace. She heard everything. She had learned, over years of working in homes like this one, how to be present without being seen, how to absorb what happened around her without reacting. She kept her expression calm and continued her work. It was Margaret's younger son, Daniel, who caused the moment that changed the night. Daniel was 22, home from university for the holidays, and he had inherited his mother's tendency toward performance without her discipline or restraint. He had been drinking steadily since the guests arrived. When he spotted Adiz near the piano, something about the image struck him as amusing. He pointed at her and said to the small group around him that perhaps their maid could fill in for Celeste, and he laughed at his own suggestion, the way people laugh at jokes they know are cruel. Two of his friends laughed with him. One of the women in the group smiled uncomfortably and looked away. Margaret heard it and said nothing. The other guests nearby heard it and continued their conversations. Adiz heard it clearly. She set down her tray carefully on the nearest surface. She looked at Daniel for a moment without anger, without embarrassment, and without the apologetic expression that might have been expected of someone in her position. There was something in her stillness that made the small group around Daniel go quiet, though none of them could have explained exactly why. She walked toward the piano with a steadiness that came not from arrogance, but from something much older and more certain than arrogance. She sat down on the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed her hands on the keys. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took a few seconds, the way a wave takes time to reach the shore after the wind has already changed. The first note she played was soft. It did not announce itself or demand attention the way some opening notes do when a performer is trying to impress. It simply arrived, clean and round and certain, and it hung in the air of the drawing room long enough for the people nearest the piano to stop their conversations without fully understanding why they had stopped. The second note followed, and then the third, and by the time her left hand joined her right, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room that no one present would have been able to name in the moment, but that all of them would remember afterward. She was playing Rachmaninoff, the second piano concerto, arranged for solo piano, a piece of such technical and emotional complexity that even conservatory-trained musicians approach it with caution. She had chosen it not to show off and not to make a point, though it would do both of those things before she was finished. She had chosen it because it was the piece that lived most naturally in her hands, the one she had returned to again and again over years of practicing on borrowed instruments, on keyboards in community centers, on the upright piano in the back room of a church in Brooklyn, where she had attended services during her first years in America. It was the piece that felt most like home to her fingers, and so it was the piece that came when she finally sat down at an instrument worthy of it. The guests near the back of the room were still talking, but those closest to the piano had gone completely still. Patricia, who had complained loudly about the evening feeling incomplete, was standing near the window with a glass of wine halfway to her mouth, and she did not move it. The man who had laughed at the whispered comment earlier turned slowly toward the piano with an expression that had lost all of its earlier ease. Daniel, who had made the joke that started everything, was standing exactly where he had been standing, but the laughter had left his face entirely, and something else had taken its place, something uncomfortable and difficult to look at directly. Margaret Hargrove stood near the doorway between the drawing room and the hall. She had been preparing to move her guests toward the dining room, had been mentally calculating how to redirect the evening now that the performance had been canceled. When she heard the music begin, she had assumed, for one brief and confused second, that Celeste had recovered and come downstairs. Then she turned and saw Adiz at the piano, and she stood completely still for a reason she could not immediately identify. It was not outrage, though outrage would come later, or something that tried to look like outrage. What stopped her in that moment was the music itself, because it was extraordinary, and Margaret Hargrove had been around enough music in her life to know the difference between competence and something that went beyond it. Adiz played without sheet music. Her back was straight but not rigid, and her body moved slightly with the phrases the way a musician moves when the music is not something they are producing, but something they are experiencing in real time. Her eyes were open and focused on a middle distance that was not the room and not the guests, but somewhere inside the piece itself. Her hands moved across the keys with a confidence that was entirely without performance, and that absence of performance was, paradoxically, the most compelling thing about watching her. She was not playing for the room. She was simply playing, and the room was fortunate enough to be present. The piece built slowly, as Rachmaninoff builds, gathering weight and density with each passing minute, the melody rising and then pulling back and then rising again with more insistence than before. By the time she reached the emotional center of the arrangement, several guests had quietly moved closer to the piano, repositioning themselves without discussion or coordination, drawn forward by something that operated below the level of social calculation. An older gentleman who had been standing near the drinks table for most of the evening walked all the way to the front row of chairs and sat down without pouring the refill he had come for. Two women who had been deep in conversation near the fireplace had stopped talking entirely and were watching Adiz with expressions that mixed astonishment with something softer and harder to categorize. No one laughed. No one whispered. The room that had been buzzing with the particular noise of a social gathering, the sound of people performing their own ease and wit and importance for one another, had gone completely silent except for the piano. Daniel had not moved from his spot. He was watching Adiz with the look of someone who has said something they cannot take back and are only now understanding the full weight of what they said. His friends, the ones who had laughed with him, were also quiet, and the silence between them had a quality that was different from the silence of the room around them. Their silence was specific and personal and not comfortable. Margaret watched her maid play and felt something she was not prepared for. She had known Adiz for 3 years. She had seen her every day, had given her instructions, had evaluated her performance in the way employers evaluate the performance of household staff, efficiently and without much curiosity about the interior life of the person carrying out the tasks. She realized, standing in the doorway with the music filling every corner of the room her family had built, that she had never once asked Adiz anything about herself. Not her history, not her interests, not what she had left behind to come here and fold their linens and polish their floors and serve their guests. She had been a function, not a person, and the piano was making that truth impossible to ignore. The music moved into its final passages, and Adiz's playing did not tire. If anything, it deepened, the notes becoming more deliberate and more resonant as she approached the end, as though she was not finishing the piece but settling into it, finding its truest weight before letting it go. When the last chord finally faded and her hands lifted from the keys and rested in her lap, the silence that followed was not the silence of an ended thing, but the silence of something that had just become permanently true. No one moved for several seconds. Then the older gentleman who had walked to the front row began to applaud, and within moments every person in the room had joined him. The applause lasted longer than anyone had planned for it to last. It was not the polite, rhythmic clapping that typically follows a performance at a gathering like this one, the kind that signals appreciation without requiring genuine feeling. This was different. It was uneven and slightly disorganized in the way that spontaneous things are, people starting and stopping and starting again, some of them standing without having made a conscious decision to stand. The older gentleman in the front row was on his feet before the last echo of the final chord had fully left the room, and he clapped with the focused energy of someone who had spent a lifetime around music and knew precisely what he had just witnessed. Adiz turned on the bench to face the room. She did not bow dramatically or smile the wide smile of a performer receiving their due. She dipped her head once, quietly, in the manner of someone acknowledging a shared moment rather than claiming a triumph. Then she rose from the bench, smoothed her uniform with both hands, and stood with a composure that was entirely natural and entirely devastating to everyone in the room who understood what it meant. The older gentleman made his way toward her before anyone else did. His name was Harold Voss, and he was 71 years old, a retired professor of music who had spent 30 years teaching at a conservatory in New York and another decade before that performing across Europe. He had come to the Hargrove gathering because Margaret was an old friend of his late wife, and he attended every year out of loyalty to that friendship more than any expectation of enjoying himself. He reached Adiz and extended his hand, and when she took it, he held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. He asked her where she had studied. She told him about the church organist in Lagos, about the teacher who had recognized something in her, about the years of practicing on instruments that were never quite right for the music she was trying to play. She spoke simply and without embellishment, the way people speak when they are telling the plain truth about their own lives and have no interest in making it sound more or less than it was. Harold Voss listened without interrupting, which was not something he did often, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment before he told her that what she had just played would have been remarkable coming from anyone, and that coming from someone with her specific path, it was something he did not have an adequate word for. Around them, the room was slowly returning to motion. Guests were speaking to one another again, but the conversations had changed in texture. The easy social performance of the earlier part of the evening had been replaced by something more genuine and more uncertain. The kind of talk that happens when people have been moved by something and are trying to process it through language without quite succeeding. Several guests approached Adiz in the minutes that followed Harold's conversation with her, and they were not quite sure how to position themselves as they did it, how to stand, what tone to use, because the usual social geometry of the room had been rearranged, and no one had yet figured out the new coordinates. Patricia, the woman who had complained about the evening feeling incomplete, came to stand near Adiz with a glass of wine she was holding more tightly than necessary. She said that the performance had been absolutely wonderful, and her voice carried the slightly strained quality of a person making an effort that does not come naturally to them. Adiz thanked her with the same quiet steadiness she had carried throughout the evening. Patricia lingered for a moment as though she wanted to say something further, something that might rebalance what had shifted, but she could not find the words and eventually moved away. Daniel had not approached the piano or Adiz since the music ended. He was standing near the far wall with a drink in his hand that he had not touched since he poured it, talking to no one, looking at nothing in particular with the fixed expression of a person who is very busy inside their own head. One of his friends had tried to restart their earlier conversation, and Daniel had responded in single syllables until the friend gave up and drifted elsewhere. What was happening in Daniel was not simple embarrassment, though embarrassment was part of it. It was the more complicated and less comfortable experience of seeing someone clearly for the first time after having looked at them without seeing them for a long time. He had made a joke. The joke had been cruel because it was built on an assumption, the assumption that Adiz's position in the household was a complete description of who she was, that the uniform and the tray and the quiet efficiency were the whole of her, and that anything beyond those things was so unlikely as to be funny. The piano had not just proven the assumption wrong. It had revealed the assumption itself, held it up to the light of the entire room, and made it impossible to look away from. Margaret had moved through the remainder of the evening doing what she did best, managing the flow of her gathering, directing people toward the dining room, ensuring that glasses were filled and conversations were guided toward comfortable ground. But she was distracted in a way that her oldest friends noticed and her newer acquaintances did not. Her eyes returned to Adiz throughout the evening, watching her as she resumed her work, collecting glasses and straightening surfaces with the same quiet efficiency she always brought to it. The continuity of it struck Margaret in a way she had not expected. Adiz had sat down at a grand piano in front of 40 guests and played Rachmaninoff from memory with a skill that had silenced the room and moved a retired conservatory professor to genuine admiration. And then she had stood up and gone back to work. Not as a statement, not as a performance of humility or endurance, simply because that was what the evening required of her, and she understood her responsibilities and she met them. It was that continuity, more than the music itself, that stayed with Margaret through dinner and through the slow departure of her guests, and into the quiet hours after the house had emptied. The question that had begun forming in her while she stood in the doorway listening had not gone away. It had only grown more specific and more insistent as the night went on. She had employed this woman for 3 years. She had trusted her with her home, with her family's private spaces and daily rhythms, with the kind of access that requires genuine trust whether one thinks about it consciously or not. And she had never once thought to ask who she was. Harold Voss was the last guest to leave. He paused at the door and turned back to Margaret with the directness that old friendships permit. He told her that she had extraordinary staff. Margaret did not answer immediately. Harold put on his coat and said, more quietly, that he hoped she knew that. Then he said goodnight and walked out into the cold Connecticut air, and Margaret closed the door behind him and stood alone in her front hallway with the silence of her emptied house and the weight of an evening that had not gone the way anyone had planned. 2:34 p.m. The days that followed the gathering moved quietly through the Hargrove house, but the quiet was different from the quiet that had existed before. It had a new texture to it, something unsettled beneath the surface of the ordinary routines, like a room that has been rearranged slightly and feels unfamiliar even though everything is technically in its place. Adiz came to work the following Monday as she always did, arriving before the family was fully awake, moving through her tasks with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything. She did not carry the evening with her in any visible way. She did not walk differently or hold herself with any new awareness of how the room had received her. She was simply herself, as she had always been, and that consistency was its own kind of quiet statement. Margaret had spent the days between the gathering and Monday in a state of reflection that was unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. She was not a woman given to extended self-examination. Her life had been organized around action, around decisions made efficiently and executed well, around the management of appearances and outcomes with a skill she had developed over decades. Sitting with uncertainty was not something she practiced, and yet she found herself doing it, returning again and again to the image of Adiz at the piano, and to the question that image kept asking her without words. On Monday morning, she found Adiz in the kitchen preparing the household for the day, and she asked her to sit down. It was a simple request, but it was not a simple moment, because Margaret had never asked Adiz to sit in her presence before, had never created the kind of pause in the ordinary flow of work that sitting together requires. Adiz looked at her for a moment with a calm that gave nothing away, and then she pulled out a chair and sat. Margaret sat across from her. She was quiet for longer than was comfortable, and then she said that she owed her an apology. Not for Daniel, she clarified quickly, though she said that she had spoken to Daniel separately, and that he had his own apologies to make and his own growing up to do. The apology she was offering was her own, and it was for 3 years of looking without seeing, for having a person of remarkable depth and history in her home every day, and treating that person as though the work they performed was the complete boundary of who they were. She said it plainly and without excessive emotion, because that was the only way she knew how to say difficult things, and she did not dress it up or soften it into something easier to deliver. Adiz listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she appreciated it. She said it without stiffness and without the performance of graciousness that the situation might have invited. She simply meant it, and it landed accordingly. What happened next unfolded gradually over the weeks that followed, in the way that genuine changes unfold, without dramatic announcements or clean turning points, but through a series of small and consistent shifts that accumulated into something real. Margaret asked Harold Voss to come for tea, and she invited Adiz to join them. Harold came with the energy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of conversation, and he talked with Adiz for 2 hours about her training, her influences, the specific qualities he had heard in her playing that set it apart from technical proficiency, and placed it in a different category entirely. He asked if she had ever considered returning to serious study. Adiz said that she had considered it most of her life, but that consideration and possibility had rarely occupied the same space at the same time. Harold said that he still had connections, that the conservatory world was smaller than it appeared from the outside, and that what she had played in Margaret's drawing room was the kind of thing that created its own possibilities if it was placed in front of the right people. He was not making her a promise. He was making her an offer of effort, which is a more honest and more valuable thing than a promise, and she recognized it as such. Margaret, for her part, did something practical and concrete, which was consistent with who she was. She spoke to Adiz about her schedule and her financial situation with the directness that had always characterized her management of household affairs, but now directed toward a different purpose. She restructured Adiz's hours to allow 2 full days each week that were entirely her own. She arranged access to the piano in the drawing room whenever the house was not in use for social occasions. She did not frame these things as gifts or as compensation for what had happened at the gathering. She framed them as adjustments, as corrections to an arrangement that had not accounted for the full reality of the person it involved. Daniel came to Adiz on a Tuesday morning when the house was quiet and Margaret was out. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with the particular discomfort of a young man who has been raised to be confident and is learning, for perhaps the first time, what confidence built on false assumptions actually costs. He apologized without qualification and without the self-protective additions that lesser apologies contain. He did not explain what he had meant or provide context for his state of mind that evening. He said that what he had done was wrong, that it had been unkind and arrogant and built on a blindness he was not proud of, and that he was sorry. Adiz accepted his apology the same way she had accepted his mother's, cleanly and without theater, because she was not interested in making anyone suffer beyond the natural consequence of understanding what they had done. 6 months after the gathering, Harold Voss arranged for Adiz to perform at a small but significant recital hosted by a music foundation in Manhattan. The audience was composed largely of musicians, educators, and patrons of the arts, people who listened with the particular attention of those who have spent their lives in proximity to music and know how to hear what is actually being played beneath the surface of technique. She performed 3 pieces, including the Rachmaninoff she had played in the Hargrove drawing room, and the response was the same as it had been that winter evening, the same quality of silence during the playing, and the same quality of recognition when it ended. Harold introduced her to 2 people that night who would matter enormously in the year that followed. A conversation began that led to an audition, and the audition led to an acceptance into an advanced performance program that she had once believed was simply not a door that would open for someone with her particular path. But doors, she was learning, did not always operate according to the logic of the path that led to them. Sometimes a single evening changes the angle of everything that comes after it, not because it was designed to, not because anyone planned it that way, but because something true was expressed in a room full of people, and the truth had its own momentum and carried her forward with it. She continued to carry herself the same way she always had, without performance, without the need to make the distance she had traveled into a story that others could consume and feel good about. The music was hers. It had always been hers. The room had simply finally been quiet enough to hear it.